Canadian whiskey. It's the most important category right now, today, in the U.S. marketplace. It was bigger, I'll admit that. It used to be a lot bigger than it is today. And certainly Canadian whiskey numbers are dropping. But let's be honest about this. Only the cheap brands are dropping. They're plummeting. The super premium brands, the great brands of Canadian whiskey, they continue to grow in sales. Now, how is it that Canadian whiskey came to be the dominant whiskey? I mean, we make our own whiskey, right? Bourbon in Tennessee and the like. Frankly, it's called Prohibition, all right? Now, Canadian whiskey goes all the way back to 1769 with the Seagram's brand, and certainly there's been whiskeys made in Quebec and other places all the way out in Alberta throughout the 18th century and throughout much of the 19th century, but it gets important during American Prohibition. Why? The second year of American Prohibition saw a 400% increase in Canadian whiskey sales. Yeah, they were drinking more up there. No. It's coming across the Great Lakes. It's coming across this recently discovered pipeline under the Detroit River. We're drinking that stuff. We're paying top dollar. Canadian whiskey is what most people have learned to drink. If you go back to the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, Americans really didn't have their own whiskey. Bourbon in Tennessee, they were out of business. We had Prohibition, we had World Wars. You were going to use those alcohols to make weaponry. Frankly, all of it had to, by law, during World War I and World War II, be used for munitions production. So if you drank whiskey, you were drinking Canadian whiskey. And we got used to that style. And so in truth, the very broadest category, the most powerful category of whiskey in the United States is still this thing called American blended whiskey. It's probably not kind to say, but pretty close to a wannabe Canadian whiskey. Why would I say that? Because Canadian whiskey, by law, is a blended whiskey. What do we mean by that? Let's make sure that we're very clear on that. By law, no more than half of the whiskey inside a bottle of Canadian whiskey is supposed to be a straight whiskey from a grain. Most of the time it's from corn. Yeah, I know you've heard it's from rye. And yeah, you go back to the 19th century, a lot of rye whiskeys made there. And yes, there are still rye whiskeys there. And yes, there are still some rye whiskeys in barrels there that show up in some of these great ultra premium blends. But most Canadian whiskey is based on corn. Now, what you do with this corn is most of the time you make a big chunk of it into neutral grain spirit. And then you blend that neutral grain spirit into what we call a straight whiskey. It isn't distilled to as high a proof, it's not as neutral, has more flavors and aromas, still made from corn, and yeah, there's a little rye in there, and yeah, there's a little barley in there, but it's blended. Canadian whiskey is by law a blended whiskey, which means at least half of it is neutral grain spirit. So we got used to that stuff. We got used to the softer, milder character of it, and bourbon in Tennessee, the great American spirits, are still trying to find their way to some degree in this marketplace. American blended whiskey, it's in good shape because it is a blended whiskey, frankly, with very few exceptions. There are certainly exceptions, but most blended whiskey from America doesn't really hold its own that well against the great Canadian whiskeys at all, because they've learned how to make these great whiskeys from neutral grain spirit, some of these old ryes, some old corn whiskeys that have been in barrel, and some of those whiskeys are as beautiful a whiskey as you'll ever have.